Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for coming to the third of the ICLR encounters. My name is Paul McGrath. I'm Head of Product Development and Online Content at ICLR, which stands for the Incorporated Council of Law Reporting for England and Wales. Our mission is not to make light of the law, but to shine a light on the law. However, ICLR is more than just law reporting. We want to provide a forum for the discussion of the law in all its aspects, and that's the purpose of these encounters. But tonight we can let our hair down and relax a bit, because although the law is a serious subject, there is no subject of which you can't make a joke, and the law is no exception. So tonight we're going to be making light of the law, and to help us do it, we have three very brilliant guests, all of whom have made a living, or part of their living, from making gentle fun of the law and its practitioners. Tim Kevan writes the Baby Barrister blog, which is now on The Guardian, which has already spawned 2 novels about the life of an ambitious young barrister struggling to gain a foothold in chambers and then keep his career on a straight and upwards trajectory, surrounded by a cast of comic characters ranging from rival pupils to cynical solicitors, wise old leaders and confused old judges. In short, it's as funny as it's true to life. And he's here tonight to tell you who all the characters are really based on. Isn't he? I thought he was. Anyway. Gary Slapper is Professor of Law by day, but he's also the author of Weird Cases column for The Times. Now, he's here tonight to gather material for a companion volume, which is called Weird Case Reporters. Now, Alex Williams, the third guest, who's here, is like Tim Kevan, used to be a barrister, now makes fun of the whole idea in his long-running comic strip, Queen's Counsel, which you can see actually on the right there. That's one of the characters from Queen's Counsel. Like Gary Slapper's column, it appears in The Times. He's also a professional animator, having abandoned the bar for Hollywood and the lure of the silver screen. He's contributed animation for over 20 feature films, including The Lion King and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is perhaps quite appropriate. He's here tonight to discuss the visual side of legal humour. So I won't waste any more time and hand you over to our 3 distinguished guests to discuss making light of the law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. So it's an encounters session, and it's the third one, so I can't help notice that because we're closely situated, it is in fact a close encounter of the third kind. Before we begin...
Very good.
Before we begin, I want to say a couple of words about why such a serious subject as law can be light. So the law courts of the world host some of the most bizarre examples of human drama that it's possible to imagine. And pretty much anything that comes within the compass of law, definitionally, is abnormal. It means that something in some way has gone wrong. Not 100% of law is like that, but an awful lot of law is. And the oddest parts of an odd human edifice, an odd human enterprise, are decidedly strange. The parade of extraordinary human disputes, for example, and irregularities that have been heard recently in law courts, include one where judges have had to listen to a claimant like the restaurant manager who sought compensation for injury to his hand that he had sustained when he repeatedly punched a customer in the face. And a man who was fired from his job, employment law case, for being a habitual user of cocaine, marijuana, synthetic heroin, and hookers, and who always carried 2 loaded weapons to all of his drug deals, a case which was especially problematic because his day job was a federal judge. And a case where the authorities didn't accept in America that being a cat is an acceptable excuse not to serve on a jury. As Paul mentioned, Tim Kevan is the author of the Baby Barrister Files and a series of novels published by Bloomsbury. And I'm going to, in a moment, just read you a couple of favourite extracts from that to set the scene before we discuss our respective work. So Law and Disorder in 2009 was described by the Times as a cross between the talented Mr. Ripley, Rumpole and Bridget Jones's Diary. And Law and Peace was described by the Daily Mail as a funny, sharp account of backstabbing bar life, highly recommended. Jeremy Vine described it as a novel bursting with invention. Books are based on the Baby Barrister blog, which appeared in the Guardian and the Times. Tim practiced as a barrister in London for 10 years and co-founded 2 legal businesses, one of which has since been sold to Thomson Reuters. We turn to Alex Stewart Williams, as Paul said, a very distinguished film animator, cartoonist, and former barrister, who pretty much went straight from 12 King's Bench Walk to Hollywood without even staying at 12 King's Bench Walk. So, a meteoric rise. The Queen's Counsel cartoon strip was born in 1993 in the flyleaf of a civil litigation textbook during a particularly tedious stint in the law library, and we'll hear more about that later. So what I'd like to do now is to turn first to Tim and then to Alex, and to ask for some recent material, or not so recent if you prefer to start that way, of inspiration that brings you to work in the way that you do.
Thank you, Gary. I think just by way of introduction, I think this idea of making light of the law, and I think it's a noble aim to suggest that Alex and I start with serious aims and then make it funny to try and project it to a wider audience. I'm ashamed to say it's probably the other way around, that there may occasionally be serious points that come out of it, but they start from a more silly perspective that I think probably overflows from our different experiences of the law. And if there are serious points behind it, then they come out too, if that makes sense. So rather than it being this sort of didactic, preachy, slightly, making a serious point, I think they probably do come out. For my part, I did 10 years as a barrister. The last thing when I started the bar, I thought I'd be doing would be sitting here 5 years since my last case, talking about humour and the law. And there is so much humour day to day in the law. It's in the witnesses. It's in, as a barrister, you get back to chambers. As a solicitor, you're sitting around, chatting about your cases. There's just so many different aspects because, as Gary says, you're dealing with people in difficult situations, under strain. It's terrible. But the only way of dealing with it, and that professional detachment, perhaps that's just an excuse for finding things funny that you shouldn't. But I genuinely think the way people can survive in such a serious job is by making light of the law. So there's a wry sense of humour about the whole thing. It's what keeps it chugging in the sort of the music behind the serious points that you're making as the public front. It's the heartbeat behind it. And it's definitely real humour there that keeps it going. And I think with Baby Barrister, as it has in the past with things like Rumpole, and it goes way back, is sometimes they overflow into fictional characters. So that's by way of background as to where Baby Barrister came from. It wasn't suddenly, I think those Queen's Counsel cartoons are brilliant and I'm going to bring them to life and copy them in real life. I say that because I actually started reading the Queen's Counsel. I met Alex, thankfully having invented Baby Barrister, because otherwise I'd have been worried in myself. And so I started reading the Queen's Counsel books. I was like, right, I've got to finish this novel, this book deal Bloomsbury had given me. What am I going to do? Let's start getting inspiration from other books. And they were so good. So I got in touch with Alex and we chatted on the telephone. And he said, oh my goodness, I'm so pleased to hear from you, because he said, I've been avoiding reading Baby Barrister books because I didn't want to steal any of the ideas. And he said, I knew that if I even looked at them, then I'd start mining them for. So I think we've come to an agreement that you're absolutely welcome to mine them at any time you like.
Yeah, now that I have read them, I've been stealing all of Tim's books.
Actually, it's got to the point now where you ring up to see if I've got any ideas. But the wonderful thing is, Alex then brought the Baby Barrister characters to life, and I didn't know what they looked like. I just had a feeling they just said lots of bad things to each other. And they generally, the Baby Barrister characters just seemed to be rude to each other most of the time. But I didn't see it, but Alex drew them. And then when Bloomsbury asked me for more, like novel stuff that I'm no great author. And I was like, cool, what do they look like? Well, I had Alex's cartoons. So suddenly I realized that Head Clark, who, by the way, is the one character in all the books who, despite it being fiction, real life does infringe. And as a barrister, even though I haven't practiced for 5 years, Head Clark still has an impeccable reputation. The head clerk, solicitor or barrister, whichever you guys are, will know that the senior clerk of any chambers runs things, and a barrister's life and livelihood both depend upon the goodwill of the head clerk. But I think I have pointed out to him that it is the one character in the whole book that doesn't even get, the treatment of gentle satire. But there we have it. I realised when Alex had drawn the picture that he had a Richard Branson beard, or busybody. There's a character who just busybodies around chambers. Suddenly, what does she? I didn't know what she looked like, but she had curly hair. And suddenly, when she got busier, she had really curly hair. And that's with the greatest respect. I'm looking around at anyone with curly hair, but it was that was the look, or people with beards or anything. That was the look for them, and you did that for each of the characters. So I was then feeding off the cartoons, and it was wonderful. So it's lovely to, when Alex talks about the visual side, to actually, say from my own experience that it helped me write what were real characters in my head as a feeling, and suddenly you're writing what you don't know what they're going to say, and it sounds a little bit mad, but it's fun as well because they come out and say stuff that I suppose you'd never dare say in real life, even down the pub. But once and when people say, "Is it real?" or "Who are they based on?" There was one QC who said, "Who is the most rumpole QC that I've ever met?" I'm not going to say his name, but he's a lovely chap. And he said, "Tim, I'm not reading it unless you give me a crib sheet as to who's who." And there is that. But any lawyer will know that you wouldn't dare write something like Baby Barrister unless you insisted in your own mind that it was fiction. By the time it's published. It was actually Daniel over there, my former business partner, Daniel Barnett, who I remember when I first started writing it, the lawyer came out at him and he was like, "Tim, you've got to make sure this is you make it clear that it's fiction," because people were unclear when I was writing the blog. But because they were fiction, it was very liberating. And then you can sort of write all the strange, perhaps subconscious thoughts, but also conscious thoughts that you might see a judge sort of spouting stuff that you just think is complete rubbish, but you'd never dare say that about a particular judge or judgment, and you'd be much more polite. And with all then you get into the legalese, and every barrister, every solicitor is by their nature defensive because we're all used to advising people on how things shouldn't go wrong. So I think the best way you get to bring out humour where it's being published rather than in gossip around the office, which is actually where the real humour tends to lie, but where it's going public is through fiction. So it was a very liberating way of bringing out what is a reflection of the day-to-day humour in chambers or, I guess, in law firms. I'm sure Alex had the same experience.
But what if can I show some cartoons? Should I show a few drawings? I brought a few slides. This is actually, I don't know if you can actually read from the back. This is my first ever cartoon in the Times. So that was back in October of 1993. And so this was sort of me imagining what the law was like from outside, really, trying to think. When I went to the bar, I was a pupil. And so the jokes became sort of about what it was like being a pupil barrister. So they were very much based on my own experience of going into court. And this was when, basically as a pupil barrister, I was essentially terrified of performing. And so if the case would get cancelled, I'd be delighted because I got to go home back to chambers and I got to collect my fee and didn't actually have to say anything, which was brilliant. That was the best day ever. And then I had to say to the client how sorry I was that, it was all this expense wasted and they'd have to come back another day. I was just totally thrilled. So the jokes at this stage all came out of my experiences, and I was absolutely terrified of telling my chambers that I did this because I thought they'd assume that I would just make jokes about them, which indeed was the case. But it actually turned out to be a good thing because. As a pupil barrister, there's so much competition. I mean, this was 20 years ago, there was so much competition for the bar. Now it's ridiculous. I mean, it's just littered with Oxbridge firsts. And, you're all the candidates are clever. They're all brilliant. They've all got amazing CVs. So I'll just skip through. This was a silly thing that they did in the Telegraph when I was, because I had done some film animation in Hollywood, so I was getting these calls to go to LA, and somebody did I forget who it was, somebody ran this thing saying that I was a young barrister turning my back on a lifestyle of fast cars, jacuzzis, and huge paychecks to remain at the bar. And this actually got picked up by some DJ, because I remember I was sitting in the car listening, and there was some guy on the radio saying, he was saying, God, you know, there's this barrister, and he's got all this offers to go to Hollywood, and he's going to have fast cars and jacuzzis, and he wants to stay at the bar. What a moron! And then they played the next song. I thought, my God, he's talking about me. And then I came back to work in films in London, and I did this book, Lawyers Uncovered, which is one of my favourites, and that's the back cover. So it's only funny if you see the reverse angle. Just really stupid ways of detonating your career. I won't show you any of that, but it's sort of this was the cover, or inside the cover. My dedication to Sarah, who really, really didn't want to leave the law. I didn't want to get into trouble at her firm. I think it's too late for that now. So here's some pictures from Baby B. So there's old Smoothie on the left. And we really went round the houses on these drawings, trying to find, what these characters would look like. There's Head Clerk on the right, who's, of course, the only one with a beard, because you're not allowed a beard at the bar. Facial hair is definitely forbidden, although clerks are allowed it, curiously.
I'd given him a kind of rich. I saw it when he'd done that. We didn't talk about it, but I figured you got him. He's a real entrepreneur, so he's like got a Richard Branson type of beard. So it's the little details that you suddenly, when you're looking at it, you go, "Oh yeah, they're brilliant." And look at that big mouth, and he's the Tory MP, and his snooty nose in the end. And this was Tim's idea for Baby B, and I knew this was a good idea because I was annoyed with it that I hadn't thought of it myself. This idea that all pupil barristers should have L plates, because you're essentially when you begin, you're just beyond useless. I was always amazed by the solicitors who instruct me as a junior barrister. Cause why are you giving me money? I should be paying you. I'm completely useless, and you're paying me to go in to do this stuff. And so the L plates, I thought that was a lovely idea. And here's a joke I did that was actually for the ICLR, although it wasn't. This was sort of for the ICLR. It was because Sarah was reading 50 Shades of Grey and telling me how rubbish it was, and reading out excerpts of it at night, and then having told me what a terrible book it was, she went off and bought the other two and read those as well. So I sort of got a free joke out of that. And then I did, this was fun. This is my latest book, the official Queen's Counsel Officials Lawyer's Handbook, which was done by, actually written by an American called Dan White, who's a brilliant, very, very funny lawyer. And he wrote this back in the late 80s. So it was about becoming a lawyer, and I basically turned it, I anglicized it and brought it up to date. And so I sort of rewrote it. But this is the book that I like the most of my work. So it's a joint effort, but this is the one that I think is the funniest, because it is actually, and this is really Dan's work that I'm praising here, but it is actually, he's so accurate when he describes what you have to go through to make partner in a law firm. It's so unbelievably accurate. I mean, I would read sections of it out to Sarah, and it was like describing her life. She's not a partner, I shouldn't add. So it's been a lot of fun, and working with Tim has been huge fun, and we've become friends through it, and it's been loved doing the Baby B stuff.
For some more, let me just tell you about the case of Sam Ketfield. He's a defense attorney in America, and the principal weapon of advocates, of course, is language. But Mr. Ketfield took a different view in a case recently where, in the middle of a case, he walked over to the jury box and took out from his pocket a hand grenade and put it on the ridge, and then pulled the pin. And, an unconventional view of a way to explain to the jury the nature of fear. He was running a duress defence, and after he pulled the pin, he said to them, "Are you scared now?" So this ended predictably badly for him. It's, you can see where this is going to go. I think that what we were looking at earlier, that contrast between the chilling reality of so much which is important in almost all branches of law, and the seriousness with the way that it's leavened sharply by humour. And there are various definitions of what humour is, but what is a very common element among those definitions is the sudden drop from something extremely serious to something not serious. And a lot of humour is characterised by that formula. So you can see that law is an exceptionally ripe territory for that. Things only need to go a little bit wrong, especially when the edifice itself of law, that law courts, lawyers, judges, and the parts of people's lives are at stake, unless it's leavened in this extremely clever way by the colleagues here, it would be in danger, I think, socially, of being taken too seriously. Particularly, that applies to many professions. It socially requires itself to have that type of arch seriousness, so that when you get something which is a little bit off line, it makes it much easier to digest. A man called Wallace Weatherholt recently had his hand bitten off, unfortunately, by an alligator in Florida. And he's just been prosecuted for the offence of feeding an alligator. It's absolutely true. He's been convicted of feeding an alligator because the way that people perceive the legal professions, the judiciary, the society that they live in, is as much framed by funny incidents as it is by reading long polemical articles. I'm sure that must be so. And the relationship, between art and creative arts and life.
I like that idea that, certainly it can set the paradigm within which you see things. But anyway, here's a slightly, it's not really a serious one, but it's one, it just reminds me, I'm just picking out different ones, but because we've talked about the clerks and how you have to defer to them. So this is one about Old Ruin chatting to head clerk. And it's called Who Guards the Guards? Old Ruin was in chambers today and talking to head clerk about police powers. It's the age-old problem, he said. It's all very well having an independent police force, but then who guards the guards? We do, the people, said head clerk. Through Parliament. You're right, of course, answered Old Ruin. But who guards them? Well, the judges do, I suppose, said head clerk. But now you're going to ask me, who guards them, I suppose? It had crossed my mind. Well, it's the barristers who guard the judges against the worst of their excesses, expose their weaknesses, steer them away from the folly of their instincts, as head of chambers always likes to put it. I see. So it's the bar who actually guard the guards. Well, yes, I suppose it is. Old Ruin paused for effect. And who would you say guards them? Head clerk beamed as he suddenly realised where Old Ruin had gently led the conversation. Why, it's the clerks, of course. You're absolutely right, Old Ruin. I hadn't thought of it like that before. Through a long and convoluted network of checks and balances, it's ultimately the humble barrister's clerk who guards our democratic freedoms. Quite so, said Old Ruin.
It's a Byron quotation from 1823. Truth is stranger than fiction. Mark Twain put a gloss on that by saying that the reason why truth is stranger than fiction is that fiction has to stick to realities, whereas truth doesn't. And so it's an interesting paradox there. Back to Alex and for more stories.
Well, I was thinking, Gary, because you were talking about memorable cases. I think I'd spent my summer working at Disney on a movie, and it was literally the next day I had to come back and do this pupillage interview, and I couldn't remember anything. And they asked me if there were any particularly interesting cases that I had studied at law school that I would like to discuss. And the only case that I could remember was one which popped into my head. It was called Regina versus Brown. This is a 1993 decision. I don't know if anybody remembers this case, but it was a pretty fruity case involving some people in Bolton, I think of all places, sure, who had been, it was all to do with what you could consensually do, what consenting adults could actually get up to. This was the only thing I could remember. It involved hammers and nails, and I won't tell you anymore. it was pretty grim stuff.
Rusty nails, actually.
Rusty nails, rusty nails. It was, but and so I actually mentioned, Regina versus Brown, and then realised that was the end of the pupillage interview. That was the moment when, and I bet, this just great gaping void opened up in front of me, and I realised I'd blown the whole thing. They just looked at me and essentially as if you seriously want us to discuss Regina versus Brown. And that was the end. They just said, we talked about the weather for about a minute after that, and then I was shown the door. And I realised at that point that I actually had to go through my notes and try and come up with something intelligent to say at a pupillage interview.
Are we right for time now?
Thank you very much. So if anyone would like to ask a question, put your hand up and we'll get to you with a microphone.
Joshua Rosenberg. I covered the case you were referring to, Brown, the sadomasochist case, and it was very curious because piercings were rather unusual in those days. And I was interviewing this man. I can't remember whether he had a pierced lip or a pierced tongue, but he was sort of, fidgeting with this ring through some visible part of his anatomy. I'm sure there were others as well. And it was very disconcerting because at that stage, these men decided they wanted to be anonymous. And so we filmed it with the back of his head to the camera, and the camera was looking at me, and I was nodding as this man was describing what happened and what he did and why he thought it ought to be lawful. And you saw my face looking more and more uncomfortable as this man was telling me what these people did to each other and why they all consented and why they all thought it was lawful. So it's very nice to be reminded of those earlier.
A little trip down memory lane.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Tim Kevan and Gary Slepper and Alex Williams for shining the light on the lighter side of the law. What I think it does demonstrate is that although you can be quite humorous about the law, it stems from a basic, deep-seated love of the law. I think all of you have demonstrated that it's a fondness of the law that makes you find it funny. And this has been the third ICLR encounter, the close encounter, as it were. Look out for future encounters, which will be advertised on our website, iclr.co.uk. And thank you all very much for coming this evening.